Welcome to Profiles in UFOlogy, a series of programs devoted to disseminating information about and presenting various interpretations of the UFO phenomenon and related matters. Our intent is to broadly raise awareness of the phenomenon among the general public, as well as to stimulate deeper reflection and dialogue within the ufological community. Our guest today on this edition of Profiles in UFOlogy is Dr. Richard F. Haines. Dr. Haines holds a Ph.D. in experimental psychology and is a retired NASA research scientist and former chief of the Space Human Factors Office at NASA's Ames Research Center. He has studied UFO evidence for over 37 years. Is that?
30 is close enough.
And has written 6 major books and numerous papers and articles on the subject. One of his special areas of interest is UFO sightings by pilots, civilian, commercial, and military, and air traffic controllers. His most recent book is entitled CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, a study of some 242 case files involving human-initiated deliberate contact, human behavior which was followed by an obvious response from a UFO and or a humanoid being, the response suggesting by virtue of its effects that its response was not merely coincidental, but elicited. Welcome to the program, Dr. Haines. It's an honor to have you.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Perhaps we could begin by talking a little bit about how you yourself initially got drawn into this field.
Well, it all began in about 1965 when I was working for the space program as part of the Gemini effort to perfect rendezvous and docking using a two-man capsule. And so I developed a laboratory that would allow me to simulate the way objects look to the astronauts in space, in orbit. And this involved a solar simulator, in other words, realistic sunlight, and a clean room where there's no dust in the air. And literally you could go into this dark, pitch-black room and clap your hands, and the room would just explode in light because of the skin particles coming off the palms of your hands that were otherwise invisible, you see. Well, that's what happens in space, too. So you now have to wear gloves. So we started wearing gloves to keep from contaminating. Well, that's another subject. And I found pretty quickly in that research program that I could set up an optical arrangement of stimuli, of shapes of objects or models or whatever, and illuminate them in such a way that you could not objectively tell me what you were looking at. You'd think you're looking at a circle, when in fact I could prove that it was a triangle. And I understood why. This is what I'd done my doctoral work on. And so I said to myself, I can explain UFOs, they're just misidentified natural phenomenon. And so I really set out kind of seriously to try to disprove the whole thing as a skeptic. And I don't mind admitting that, because that's in the tradition of science. To maintain an open mind, look at the data, let the data speak for itself, and then you go where the data leads you. And so I started looking at the data, but from the standpoint of pilots. So I interviewed commercial pilots and military pilots that were volunteering for research at Ames Research Center. And on a surprisingly large number, or proportion-wise, they started telling me stories that I just could hardly believe. And these were high-altitude encounters. These were not optical effects like I'd been able to simulate in the laboratory. And I began to realize that I was wrong, that I couldn't explain these things, at least most of them, maybe some of them. And that, in fact, something else is going on that turns out to be pretty important. And so that's how I got started. And I've just been following the leads over the years as they come along, and again, trying to be objective and let the data speak for itself.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've always been very impressed by in your work, your body of work, is that you have been very cautious and very careful. You do avoid dogma. You do let the phenomenon speak for itself, as you say. And I guess especially these days in ufology, there are an increasing number of people who don't seem to follow that very scientific methodology. In fact, let's talk a little bit about, you've been involved in this field for some time now. You've seen things come and go and seen changes in the field. What is your take on the state of ufology today, and if there are things wrong with it, what might be done to fix it?
Well, just for the record, today is June 18th, 1999. And maybe on June 24th I might change my view. But as of today, I'm quite discouraged, very frankly. I'm not pleased with what I see happening in this field for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with a real vacuum of leadership. That in the halcyon days, let's say 20 years ago or more, there were some very prominent spokesmen that had stature, that could speak on behalf of the whole field, and the rest of us in the field, I was very young at that point, could really, we would find comfort, we would find something to be proud of in the statements made by the leaders. Not anymore. I'm sorry to have to say that. Another concern that I have is that we seem to be running out of creative ideas. There seems to be a dead end almost. We're forced into extreme positions, continua, either ET or not ET, or either hostile or friendly, or whatever. Those are extreme positions. And I think that if we're going to use the methods of science, we really ought to leave all the doors open, not jump to any conclusions whatsoever, and leave the bias, leave the dogma. We don't have room for dogma here. And I think that we're going to be more surprised at what we find than we ever could imagine. I think another concern that I have is that we have this mistaken view that ufology is an amateur endeavor and shouldn't be in the province of the professional. It's almost like we're jealously guarding it. And we don't have any right to do that. It's too important a worldwide phenomenon. It's almost as if we would be disappointed if it were discovered, explained. Then our importance would be diminished, you see. We would have to stop meeting socially, you see, and so forth. So those are just a few answers to your question.
Okay. What constructive things might be done to, what steps could be taken that might improve the situation?
Well, if we're serious about recruiting new talent, which is essential, we must recruit young, fresh, creative thinkers. If we don't, we're the last generation. Well, in order to do that, we have to have funding. There's got to be money somewhere to encourage professors, young professors, for instance, to take a look at this seriously, so that you can go to, like the NSF, National Science Foundation, and you could apply for a grant to look at a certain aspect of UFO phenomena. There's no possibility of that right now because of the biases that are existing. So funding is certainly one of the things that we really need to get over. And there are a number of interesting and positive developments in that field recently, where money is being made more and more available, and perhaps an institute someday, I would hope so, where people could apply for research support and so forth. But it's slow, and it's becoming kind of bureaucratized, so that the process of appealing for that money is a daunting task, and it almost discourages you from even trying, you see. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have to qualify. That's not the point. You should have to qualify. That's going to maintain high standards. But there's a point beyond which it's a waste of time, you know. If the chance of getting a grant is 10% out of 100%, and you spend 3 months writing a proposal, it's not worth it for most people, you know, for like $10,000 or even $50,000. But if you think the probability is 80 or 90% of getting a grant, then it is worth 3 months, 4 months of your career to write a proposal.
Sure. Well, maybe that's part of the problem, or part of the answer to my next question, which is, why is there such a stormy relationship between ufology and mainstream science? And I'm sure there are many factors, one of which might be scientists have to make a living too, and they go where the funds are available, and if funds are not being diverted or put forth to support certain things, they're simply not going to go there. And that's one issue. But why are they at such odds? Why will so many mainstream scientists simply dismiss it out of hand?
Well, I really can't speak from the UFO side because I'm not a member of any organization, and I don't keep close contacts with that particular group of people. But I think I can comment from the scientific side. And you've put your finger on one issue, which is funding, certainly. You cannot mount an expedition to the South Pole on out-of-pocket expenses, you see. Or you can't develop a rapid response team to fly anywhere in America when there's some new major sighting on the milk money you save, or your wife gives you. It just doesn't work that way. So funding is certainly a real concern. But I think another concern that the scientist has is the ridicule factor. That systematically now, for I would say at least one, if not two generations, there has been, I think, a deliberate attempt to ridicule the whole subject, so that it is really not considered as a legitimate activity. Well, it doesn't take very many generations before no academic in his right mind is going to touch this subject, you see. Without a whole lot of confidence or bravery or whatever you might call it. So I think that the ridicule factor is another concern that exists. I think there's a third concern, and that is that the very nature of the phenomenon is so unpredictable. Science has difficulty with short-lived processes. You look at subatomic particle physics, for instance. It's not impossible to study these particles, but it's difficult, and you need very expensive cameras and sensors that capture the phenomenon and so forth. Say inside a cyclotron. But that's quite different from trying to go out into the real world, like into Wyoming, for instance, and to capture the phenomenon there so that you can study it scientifically. So the unpredictability is, I guess, the third concern from a scientific point of view. And the third is kind of related to the fourth is related to the second, which is the ridicule factor. The current crop of devotees are generally so zealous that I think a lot of academics just don't want to get associated with them, like it will rub off or something. Mm-hmm. You understand?
Sure. Guilt by association. Yeah. So there's that. There's the essential non-replicability of the phenomenon, which is, after all, what science, much of it is built on. And you can't put aerial phenomena in the laboratory and run it through several times. Yeah. And you said something about the ridicule factor, and you alluded to, you thought that some of it might be deliberate. Can you what do you?
Well, you're raising a much larger issue, or perhaps I raised it, I don't know, that there's a plan underway or in place to discredit this whole subject so that it becomes so absurd that nobody seriously would look at it. Well, from a classic disinformation point of view, that's the kind of technique that's often used. Not always, but it can be used very effectively. And so by planting seeds of misunderstanding and distrust and fear and humor, proving that UFOs exist and at the same time proving they don't exist, you have a bodyguard of lies. And as I think Winston Churchill once said, the best protection for the truth is a bodyguard of lies. That's where it came from. It's actually the title of a wonderful history book by Anthony Cave Brown, British historian, about the cracking of the Project Ultra Code during the war, World War II. And so I come back to that quite frequently, that a bodyguard of lies can be interpreted many ways, but I see it applicable to this field in what may be happening to discredit those who study this subject.
Sounds just a little bit ominous, doesn't it?
does. Well, that's one interpretation.
Yeah. Why would whoever is doing the discrediting have such a vested interest in that?
I have no idea.
Don't know why, but it seems to be the case.
Well, it's
Possibly.
possibly. Again, 4 days from now, I might change my mind.
We always have that right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's turn you to some of your specific work and your data and writings and so forth. A lot of people have the sense that the UFO phenomenon is a modern, recent phenomenon, that it began in the 40s, with the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Roswell event and so forth. But there's some very interesting historical stuff that suggests that it may go much, much earlier. What's your take on that question as to the age of the phenomenon?
Well, first of all, I have to admit I'm not a historian. I'm not by training, only by avocation and interest. I read a lot, and I love history, but I'm not a historian. And that is a whole academic discipline with its own approaches and methodologies that should be brought to bear. So when I say that Passport to Magonia, for instance, contains historic information, I have to take it on faith that Jacques Vallée did his homework, you see. Or whoever, Pliny writes of some flying shields over Italy in 700 BC, or whatever. I probably have the dates wrong. I have to assume that he did his research and it was all accurate. I haven't done that research. So I guess I would just say that the evidence is very suggestive, and that's about as far as I'd want to go.
Mm-hmm. Again, yeah, very careful. Yeah, it is suggestive, and I guess that is about all you can say. But there are reports or stories like that all through human history, aren't there?
Yep.
Ancient Indian texts speak of vimanas and
cave drawings in France, prehistoric. That's right.
But we weren't there, and we didn't do the research.
Well, maybe you were. I wasn't.
So it's illuminative, maybe, but it's not much you can do with.
Suggestive. That's all.
That's the best word for it. Okay, your latest book, CE5. Now, a lot of our viewers are familiar with the nomenclature, but some of them aren't. So maybe you could kind of, first of all, walk us through J. Allen Hynek's list of categories, and I think he ended at CE3, and then take us beyond to CE5.
Okay. Well, by definition, J. Allen did a wonderful service by developing a taxonomy, a classification scheme that we could all use later on in a very creative way, a very dynamic, flexible way. But it had limits to each of these categories that bounded the subject matter, and that's really important in a taxonomy. And also independent boundaries, so that you reach the division between one is clearly separate from the next, you see, an independence of the categories. So, a close encounter of the first kind, by definition, is simply a sighting or report of a apparently three-dimensional object at a fairly close range, usually a football field or less, 300 feet. And that's it. It will usually fly away, and that's the end of the story. That's a CE1. A CE2, on the other hand, is vastly different because it refers to sighting an object just as before, except after it leaves, it has left measurable changes in the environment. And these might be deposits of some material, impressions in the ground, burnt vegetation, broken vegetation, dehydration, radiation, on and on and on. This is the stuff of science. Now, this is evidence, you see. You don't have the original object, but you have what it left behind, the consequences. And science loves that.
Yeah, let's stop right there on that one for a minute and talk about some of those after effects, because I think those are important. Because that's where you can begin to, you have at this point something to work with. It's more than just a sighting and a story. You've got something that you can measure and examine and test and begin maybe to draw some tentative ideas about. What do we know from such physical effects? You refer to scorch marks and impressions, and I guess there are electromagnetic effects and so forth. Are these clues? I'm sure they must be, to the nature of what?
Well, the way I view the phenomenon, they're definitely clues. That if an object has mass and any inertia at all, and a forgiving surface like mud or dirt, it's going to leave an impression. Well, civil engineering now has progressed to the point of knowing a lot about the original object long after it's gone by what it's left behind. If you have an impression in metal, you can do a Brill test, which is a hardness test on that metal, and you can calculate the amount of force required to produce that dimple or whatever it was, or scratches, or whatever, you see. If there are samples left behind, you can take them to the electron mic lab or some chemistry lab and do tests for their elemental constitutions or the isotopic ratios. That's all very valuable. And a lot of work's been done in that area. What amazes me is that so few physical scientists have gotten interested in it. It's as if it doesn't exist, and yet it does exist, you see. So there's something else going on that takes us into the area of denial and psychological processes very quickly, you see. So that's a CE2. A CE3 refers to sighting a very large object as before, pretty much like before, except on it, in it, around it, are some sort of beings, sentient beings, sometimes called humanoids or aliens. There's a dozen names. And usually there's very little interaction with them, although sometimes there is. Well, Alan Hynek felt that it was necessary to have two more categories. One was nocturnal lights, which refers to essentially any point source of light at night, self-emitting, a radiating source. And finally, a radar visual that would subsume all the other sightings, kind of intermediate category. Well, those 5 categories were very sufficient for quite some time because most of us were just unwilling to accept the possibility that UFOs were piloted, you see, that there couldn't be life forms in them somehow. They may be robots at the most, like, remotely piloted vehicles or whatever, controlled somewhere else. But we just steadfastly denied that life forms could be associated. So the next category that had to be developed was a close encounter of the fourth kind. And that has kind of, by popularity, come to be known as an abduction, where there's an intense interaction between a human being and a non-human being, allegedly. Some years later, Jacques Vallée proposed a whole new numbering system, a taxonomy system from Allen's. And he published it in his book, and it never seemed to catch on, actually. But he coined the term close encounter of the fifth kind. And he proposed that that be used to refer to any human injury case. Well, in about 1992, I think it was, Dr. Stephen Greer, who is the founder and director of the CSETI group, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, he coined CE5, so we now have 2 definitions, and his definition basically is human-initiated contact, where the human being acts proactively and goes and does something overtly to attract the attention, if possible, and hopefully to get some sort of response. Well, as I considered those 2 competing definitions, as I was doing research on this book, this CE5 book, it occurred to me that injury cases was really not a broad enough, it did not cover enough events, basically. To me, that's a subcategory, let's put it that way. You can have injury in a CE1 if it falls on you, or a CE2 if you trip and fall into the hole it made, you see, or if a CE3 if they squeeze your hand too tightly, and so forth. So I adopted, essentially, I used Steve's definition because it's a broad category. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. Those are the basic categories as we know them right now.
And just to be real clear for everybody, a CE3 is sighting of occupants, I suppose.
That's all.
But nothing more. I mean, there's almost a historical trend when you read the literature, or if you've read the literature over the years, that seems to follow the categories. I mean, the earliest literature was only about sightings in the air, and then we had landings.
That's right.
And nobody thought for a while there would be any landings. Then we had landings, and then we had sightings of occupants. But it'd be you're hiking in the woods and you see a figure and he jumps on the ship and it takes off. I mean, there wasn't any real interaction. It was just a sighting, and that would be a CE3.
Well, I agree with you up to a point. I think I would have to say, though, that what we may be seeing is what's called a reporting artifact. That when you have terms to define something, you're more likely to use those same terms rather than different terms. And now that we have CE5 and it begins to be accepted and used in the culture, worldwide culture, I think we're going to see a rapid rise in the number of CE5 cases. That's what I'm expecting. I don't know, it's too soon to tell, but I think so.
Mm-hmm. I see what you're saying, yeah. Okay, so the CE5 is that sort of event where it's initiated by the human.
Yes.
It's not something that is initiated the other way around.
No, that's
okay.
Right.
The human does something. In some of your cases, it's flashing a flashlight or waving the arms or something, some overt action. Although not always. Sometimes there's been some more subtle.
That's right. I think the key distinction needs to be made here. It is that all the previous categories have been passive responses of the human being. CE5, for the very first time, represents a proactive approach, where we begin to take some initiative. That if you can elicit a response back from the phenomenon, whatever it is, a message sent has been a message received. And you know that because they're responding back, you see. Now it raises the issue of what is communication. And we're sitting here talking right now, and that's communication to some degree in the English language. But you're giving me a lot of nonverbal cues right now, as I am to you. Well, we're both residents of this planet. What happens if you're an alien and I'm a human? I don't have the same basis of understanding of the communication, you see. So your nod might be a prelude to killing me, you see. I don't know. So we have to be awfully careful.
There is no common coin there.
That's right. And as I've made points before on the same subject, the scorpion embraces its victim before the tail comes over and kills him. So we have to be careful here, you see. What is a friendly human behavior? What is a friendly, quote, their behavior?
Yeah, that's always been an issue in this whole field, the risk of anthropomorphizing things and putting it into human categories, and and that's a very very risky thing to do. I mean, you could completely misjudge everything.
That's right.
Okay, so the CE5 is a human-initiated phenomenon that then elicits a response, and that response seems to suggest that it's definitely an intelligence responding.
Not necessarily. I wouldn't say definitely proves it. I think the jury is still out on that one. But this book that I just finished writing has over 200 cases, and many of them suggest that very strongly. I don't want to say it any longer, stronger than that, you see. And there's a table in the back that summarizes by chapter the nature of the responses that come back. And I must say that a great many of them highly suggest intelligence. I'll give you an example. Vehicle pacings. Now, normally we don't think of vehicle pacings as a CE5 event. It's at most a CE1, you see. Or if you see a humanoid on board, it might be a CE3. What makes it a CE5 in some cases is that when the human being driving the car or the truck or whatever vehicle it is, or airplane, I've got wonderful airplane cases like this in the air. When they change direction, turn the corner to get away from the UFO out of fear, they don't care two whits about signaling to the UFO. They want to get away from it. So they speed up and then turn left and screech around the corner to the left. The UFO does exactly the same thing after the car does it, you see. That's a CE5. Because whatever the human does elicits a response from the UFO, and lo and behold, it turns out to be the same response as the car made. Well, from an anthropological point of view, I could argue, I think, that they're communicating with us. hey, we're trying to be friendly up here. Don't get away from us. You see? See the point? Sure. So we have to be awfully careful not to project our own fears and biases and limited intelligence and infantile physics. And our physics is infantile. We've got a long ways to go. There's going to be a physics of the 23rd century, as Alan used to say. And he's right. So we don't know everything. We have to be awfully careful not to judge prematurely. Let's put it that way.
Okay, now in these kinds of cases, you draw a distinction in your book between those human-initiated events which are friendly and those which are more provocative, shall we say. Let's talk a little bit about each of those two kinds and what kind of responses seem to be forthcoming. Are they different? Are they the same? Can you give examples of each?
Well, I devoted a whole chapter to friendly human behavior. Now, that's clearly a judgment call because it was friendly to me. It might not be to someone else. But for instance, as I make very clear in the chapter, a wave to me is friendly. A smile is friendly. Leaving a dish of cookies out for Santa Claus is friendly. On the other hand, the next chapter is hostile, aggressive human behavior. And there are many, many cases there, I forget how many, 40 or so, 50, where people shoot guns at the UFO. That's not very friendly. And then the question I raise is, well, what does the UFO do if it does respond? Or it would be in the book. Every case has a response. What's the nature of the response to those two classifications of human behavior? And I have to say that first of all, the phenomenon, when shot at, does not shoot back. Well, that's important to know, that it's exercising a lot of self-constraint, so to speak, to put it in human terms. It could be that they're so advanced that they don't, it's like a little fly speck or something, and they don't even know they've been shot at, so they don't respond. That's a possibility. But when waved at, or a flashlight of a signal, light signal at night, by and large they signal back with the same modality as the human uses. So, for instance, if the human uses a flashlight, they'll use a beam of white light coming back. If the human flashes some coded signal and then repeats it a number of times, they will flash the same signal back a couple of times. That, to me, says intelligence. Either that or what I call the mirror response. That if you're in a pitch black room and on the opposite wall is a mirror and you're sitting over here with a flashlight and you flash Morse code into the mirror, you're going to get exactly the same thing back, but no delay, because it's a mirror response. To be included in this book, there had to be a delay. There's always a measurable delay, if not measurable, then at least perceptual delay, from the time you flashed your signal out to the time you got something back. That delay factor can be important from the standpoint of decision-making at the other end. They're deciding should they respond, or from the standpoint of what should we respond? Should we send them the exact signal back and really give them a thrill? Or should we try to say, tell them the secret of the universe in 12 bits of information? And so forth. So that delay becomes important. If the delay is too long, like an hour, I don't find a relationship there. So there's a critical window. And in fact, there's an analysis of that window in the book.
Okay, so they typically do respond in kind. If it's a flash. Typically. I must say one more thing. That I have found a remarkable number of cases where there's a light avoidance response. They don't like to be illuminated. And I didn't expect that. Cases of military searchlights, for instance, that are sweeping around, looking for the enemy or whatever, and they come to stop on a UFO, that thing's out of there. Initially stationary and then high acceleration away. That's certainly a response.
It's a response, exactly.
And it's a good thing they don't respond in kind when people shoot at them.
That's right.
Bullets don't come flying back. What do they typically do? Simply fly away, ignore it, or?
Well, again, there's a summary in the back of each of these chapters that summarize the results. Again, first of all, when shot at, they don't shoot back, maybe in one or two cases, and then they shoot a beam which is more photic, it's like photons. There's a wonderful story in there from the Korean War, 1951, where a GI shot at and hit an object with an M1 rifle. And he said the instant the round hit it, it's armor piercing, by the way, the object changed brightness and color. It went from orange-red to very bright white, bluish-white. The second thing it did was to move very jaggedly around the sky like it didn't want to be shot at again. Makes sense. The third thing it did, it emitted a low-frequency throb like a diesel locomotive engine. Very powerful low frequency. And finally, the fourth thing it did was to emit this pulsed ray. It was almost like a welder's arc that flickers, he said. It was an invisible beam of light until you looked right up the beam, and then you could see it. But from the side, you couldn't see it from the side. You had to see it from up the beam. And he said that touched my bare skin in a number of occasions before Lieutenant Evans ordered us into the bunkers. And it felt like an electrical shock, he said, kind of a tingling sensation. He said, well, my point is that I have one other case where the eyewitness shot at a UFO, and he described the object going through the same exact steps as I've just told you. Years later. And I don't think there's any way they could have read about each other.
Yeah, and that kind of evidence is interesting, the corroborative aspect of that over time. Yeah, that's very interesting. While we're talking about Korea, that case you referenced is both in your CE5 book, and it's also in your book about Korean War. Yeah, it's too good. And pilots are really good witnesses, aren't they? Because they've been trained, they know what to look for, and so they make good...
I have 5 good reasons why they're good witnesses, yeah, if you want to hear them. Sure. Well, one reason pilots are highly motivated, which means that they have a career at stake, and they're not going to make a report at all unless they've already kind of clicked off all of the things that they could have been and been left with nothing left but a UFO. Second, they are flying, they're in control of their aircraft, which means under some circumstances at least they can change their position relative to the object and try to evoke a response from it, which is what many pilots do, by the way. But more importantly, to fly above it so that they can put the UFO seen against the ground background. For by doing that, it puts an absolute distance to the object. If you see an object against the sky, you never know how far away it is. But if you see it from above against the ground background, it can be no farther than the slant range from your eye to the ground, you see, along that line. So that's very valuable to know. Another reason is that they're flying aircraft that have electromagnetic instruments on board, so that if they get readings, compass changes, or electromagnetic effects in the cockpit, that tells us a great deal about the radiative dimension of the phenomenon. And I've been very interested in that for 15 years. And I have a very, I think, growing and impressive collection of cases that are beginning to give us some insights about the magnetic field strength, for instance. Another reason pilot cases are very valuable is that they have radios, so that they can radio to the ground and ask for help. Turn on your radars, send up a jet or whatever. Or as in Captain Terrucci case, for instance, the Japan Airlines 747, that I interviewed him. And he told me that it was nighttime, pitch dark, and they were about to descend for Anchorage. They were south of Fairbanks. And a United 757 had just taken off for Anchorage for Fairbanks in the opposite direction. And so the standard operating procedure of pilots in the same vicinity at night is to flash your headlights, your landing lights, so that the other pilot can see you and positively identify who you are. Well, Captain Terrucci told me that he did that, and the other pilot did, and they both saw each other. They were about 80 miles apart at the time, crystal clear air that night. And Terrucci told me that the instant he turned his lights on to signal the other airplane, this huge UFO off his left wing just took off to the east and disappeared in a matter of seconds. It was the biggest thing he'd ever seen. He likened it to 2 aircraft carriers end to end. Wow. Just accelerating like that. Can you imagine the sonic boom and the wind, the air turbulence effect of that sort of thing. I talked to the pilot of the 757, who was the other player in this role, and he said he never saw any UFO. He saw a Taruchi above him and off to the left, about 40 miles, whatever the separation was, but he never saw the UFO.
Interesting. Now, a thing that's very interesting, you said you were very interested in electromagnetic effects, and I am too. Especially with pilots and cases like that, because they've got all those avionics, and yes. I understand that crazy things seem to happen. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of the effects are and maybe what they suggest?
Well, the Society for Scientific Exploration, SSE, recently held a UFO workshop, I think it was October of 1997 in New York, where some of us were asked to come and present physical data to this panel. And one of the cases that I shared with them was a DC-10 case that I know the pilot personally and have for many years. He's a neighbor of mine in California. Well, he was flying on autopilot at cruise altitude, cruise speed at night over New York, going into Boston. And all of a sudden, the autopilot's flying the airplane. Nobody's flying the airplane but the gyro compass, right? Well, all of a sudden, the airplane starts banking left by itself. Well, he doesn't know what's going on. The captain, so he instinctively looks out the window to the left to make sure there's not an airplane out there, which is what a good pilot does. And he said there was the brightest, roundest light at his altitude that he's ever seen. Never seen anything like that. And so the first officer is flying that leg. So the first officer hits a button on his control yoke to uncouple the autopilot and brings it back on course again. And then the object goes on away. Well, I interrogated both men and went into an awful lot of detail about what the avionic systems were and so forth, and got information from McDonnell Douglas, since it's a DC-10, and how the autopilot works and all this. Well, the three compasses in the cockpit at that moment all aimed in different directions by as much as 20 degrees. Well, that's not a very healthy situation. So the calculations suggest an extremely high magnetic field emanating from that side that was causing the sensor on the wingtip, was driving the gyro compass, to be deviating off, and the autopilot was simply following what it should follow. The field had changed, you see. So we have some hint in that case of a very intense magnetic field. The object disappeared into the night sky. Captain Daniels radioed Boston. They said, no, they radioed him, and they said, where are you going? Because they got him as soon as he left the proper course. And he answered something to the effect, well, we're working on it, and when we get it worked out, we'll let you know. Very relaxed and so forth. And he never reported it. It's been on national TV. That's why I can tell you the story now. Never wrote up a report. He told his boss years later, and his boss said, it's good you didn't report it.
Yeah, maybe, well, good for who?
Well, just to go on briefly with the question, because it's a very complex question. I've developed a taxonomy of aircraft electrical systems such that I can quickly code into a computer file the nature of the change in the cockpit or on board the aircraft. If a light burns out, or direction finder burns out, or the radio is static, or the radar has a return, an anomalous return. By coding each of these EM cases with this taxonomy label, so to speak, I can begin to look at patterns. That's really what I'm looking for.
Sure. I'm just curious, are any of these kind of incidents where the instrumentation might go haywire or something, presumably temporarily, it comes back to normal?
Well, not always, but usually, yeah. It's transient.
Well, I have to wonder, that sounds like a dangerous situation. Do they ever become really life-threatening?
Well, in cases where there's crashes and death, you don't get the luxury of talking to people, you see. I've heard tapes, Mayday tapes, which they curdle your blood, because at the end it's silent. And you never really know. You know, the Valentich case is a good example there, and I've got that tape.
Yeah, and I was kind of working my way over there, because that certainly is related. The Melbourne incident is the name of your book, I think. Right. For the viewers who may not be familiar with that case, maybe you could give us a quick overview of what that case was about, because it's very interesting.
Well, I would urge them to try to get a copy of the book, first of all. A young private pilot, 20 years old at the time, by the name of Frederick Valentich, he had an aviation career in mind. He wanted to be a commercial pilot. If he couldn't get into the Air Force as a pilot, he wanted to go commercial. He rented a Cessna 182 long-range model one afternoon from a airfield south of Melbourne, Australia, called Moorabbin, with the intent of flying to a little island south of the mainland of Australia called King Island, landing there, buying some crayfish, which is a delicacy, and flying back that same night so that he could get nighttime flight hours for his license, for his nighttime ticket, and gain more experience with navigation and that sort of thing. Well, he got out over the water safely, about 6 minutes out over the water, and he comes on the radio and radios to Melbourne International Airport to a flight controller there, or a flight service controller, Steve Roby, and describes, or starts out with questions. Do you have any traffic, known traffic at my altitude, 5,000 feet? And Steve comes back and he says, no known traffic. And for the next 14 minutes or so, you hear this interchange back and forth between the pilot and the ground controller, and the pilot's describing some very strange object near the airplane, doing strange things. Well, I happen to have a tape copy of that exchange, and I've done extensive amount of analysis of it. He disappeared. At the end of the tape, there's a very strange noise, which lasts about 14 seconds, a metallic noise, and then silence. And they never found him. He's never been found. Well, I went to Australia to give a talk about, less than a year ago now. And Paul Norman, who's an investigator there, and I drove to Cape Otway, the southernmost tip of the mainland, from which Frederick flew out over the water, kind of the last place he was seen, so to speak. And we talked with an eyewitness, interviewed an eyewitness, who claims to have seen Valentich in a light plane that same night, being forced down by a very bright green light right above the tail of the airplane. And we asked him would he go back to the location, and we worked out the details of angles and bearings and all this stuff. And Paul and I have written an article, and it'll be out pretty soon in SSE Journal, because we have discovered a footprint, let's call it, a splash point, in the water where we think the plane hit, with certain assumptions, of course. So that if there is a expedition, some underwater search that might be carried out, we know where to begin, a reasonable starting point. He's never been found, as I said, and it's a very fascinating case. There were some electromagnetic effects, static on the radio, for instance, this metallic noise, which we don't know what it was. There's some suggestion that the compass was rotating. So that's another case. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, okay. Very interesting case. One topic or area of interest I think that you alluded to me once was that the question of ufology looked at from a developmental point of view. Is that developmental in terms of, well, why don't you just explain to us what that's about and kind of walk us through that?
Well, I really need my notes to do it well. It's in the first chapter of my book, CE5. But I thought it was instructive to compare the field of ufology with the stages of life of a human being. So from prehistory up to about 1940, roughly, is what I would call the pre-development stage of life, maybe the gestation stage. And then there's the infant stage, which is like the next 1940 to 1950 and so forth, about roughly 10 years, where I find kind of a regularity between the human development and the development of ufology. Like there's a naivete, a curiosity, a joie de vivre of the young child for everything. And that's just what ufology had originally. You see, we were open to everything. Nothing was shut out. It was an exciting time. Everything was fun. Oh, not everything, but a lot of things were fun. We went into the adolescence, or the teen age, for roughly the next 10 years, and so forth. You have the adult period, and we're now in the pre-senile period, by the way, where there's selective forgetting. We're not remembering the past, for instance. We're not cooperating very well like some seniles do, you know, some dementia patients. And I felt that there was a fairly good correspondence there. During the adult period, I felt that there was a healthy interchange of information, good meetings were held, good quality books were written on the average. There's always examples of the other. That there was an interchange of information as adults would do. There wasn't a whole lot of backstabbing and so forth. But we've entered a new phase now, this most recent phase, I think in the 80s to the 90s, where we're acting almost senile, in a senile way. There's selective forgetting, which we can't afford to do. We've got to remember the past.
Sure. Yeah. Otherwise we'll be just repeating ourselves and quite possibly running in circles.
That's right.
I'm kind of curious also. Your background is in psychology, human factors, perception, and so forth. And so as an investigator of this sort of thing, I'm curious how that background influences how you conduct your research and investigations, or assess the reliability of witnesses and so forth. I mean, how do you apply that with people who come forward to report sightings? Does that play in?
Well, I think it's fair to say that 99.9% of the sightings are visual. And because of that, it's useful to know how vision works, perception and memory, and the foibles of memory. So I think I've relied a great deal on my experimental psychology background, not only in interview techniques and reconstructing events. When I accept a case to analyze, I try to reconstruct the whole thing from start to finish, to understand the precursors. What was the person doing 4 hours before? Had they just had a fight with their spouse or whatever? Or had they been drinking alcohol? Or are they angry? Are they happy? A big adrenaline rush? What was leading up to the effect or the experience? So just in a nutshell, it's valuable to know something about sociology and psychology.
Sure. Okay. Another topic that I want to raise with you is something that you mentioned, the relation between fractal geometry and selected UFO features.
Well, we have to begin with a definition of fractal, first of all, because most people don't know what a fractal is. It's based upon a very old Latin word, fractus, which means a part of, fracture into parts. And a mathematician by the name of Mandelbrot developed the concept and did some elegant work in mathematics, showing that nature fundamentally operates on very simple principles. For instance, if you take a jungle fern and a pair of scissors, you can cut off a tip of the jungle fern, and it becomes, when you magnify it out in large scale, if you could do that optically or with a magnifier or something, it becomes almost a duplicate of the entire plant. That's a fractal. So that would be one dimension of a fractal, is the scale dimension, the size dimension. That there's some similarity, let's say in outline form, but the only thing that's changed is the size. There are three primary variables in fractal geometry. The first is size, which is what we've just been talking about. A magnification, let's call it, or minification, because it goes both directions. You can get smaller or bigger. The second is rotation, so that, for instance, if you want to have a fractal of a pen, one way to create a fractal is to rotate it. Okay, it's still the same outline, it's just rotated. The second and last major dimension is what we call splitting up or bifurcation. You go from 1 pen to 2 pens, 2 pens to 4 pens, 4 pens to 8 pens. And if you combine those 3 factors in various combinations using computer iteration, repetitive calculations, you can create elegant, repetitive geometry functions. And Mandelbrot and many others since him have discovered that fractal geometry is found in most of nature. In the ice crystal, in the snowflake, in the cloud formation, in the outline of a bay on the ocean front. Another example, if you take a photomicrograph, which is a very close-up, high magnification photograph of a piece of granite, so that the entire picture, let's say you have a large picture, that entire picture represents 0.5 millimeter of the granite face. Now you take a photograph at Yosemite of Half Dome, which is granite face, and you print it on a 10-inch print. You can't tell them apart. Why? Because there's the same fractal principles between the two, that nature has incorporated both in granite, you see. Well, let me turn now to UFOs. What in the world does this have to do with UFOs? It occurred to me, I was asked to give a paper in Portugal a couple of years ago, so I wanted to kind of pick a novel subject that nobody'd heard of before. And it occurred to me that there were some physical characteristics of UFOs that had always been considered independent from one another. No one had integrated them into some common explanatory structure. For instance, very often people describe colored, equally spaced lights around the perimeter of a UFO. Okay? Everyone's heard of that. Sure. And some people call them portholes or whatever, but we don't care about that at this point. People have described UFOs that change shape, dynamically change shape, just morph, so to speak. That's the second feature that I got into. People have described UFOs that change size, so they will actually contract or expand. That's the third aspect that I took a look at. A fourth is overall luminosity as the object accelerates or decelerates. So there's a change in brightness or color, or both, during acceleration. That was the fourth characteristic. Well, I was thinking one day about fractals, and I said, maybe there's a relationship. Maybe the phenomenon knows how to manipulate fractal geometry and is using it to their purpose, whatever the purpose is. And one thing led to another, and I proposed that, in fact, that at the center of the phenomenon, either geometrically or conceptually, there's a seed, there's a core, and that core is almost pure energy. And a fractal always starts with a core, by the way. I forgot to mention that. You start with a seed, and then you build upon the seed. Well, I postulate that the UFO phenomenon has a core of energy that can be manipulated in very precise ways using these 3 variables of magnification, rotation, and bifurcation. And when you start applying those geometric principles to the UFO phenomenon, lo and behold, what falls out of that naturally are these 4 characteristics I've just described. So I proposed at this meeting that fractal geometry, what we know about fractals, energy manipulation basically, can not explain, but account for these 4 formerly independent characteristics of UFOs. So for instance, what you see as independent lights around the circumference are probably not lights at all. They're probably anodes or concentrations of energy that are temporary. That the boundary or surface or edge, let's call it metal, of what you see as a UFO is only temporary and it's not really there. It's just temporary to achieve some particular end. So again, I'm trying to be creative. I'm trying to look at the phenomenon in a new way, and I'm probably wrong. This is probably all wet, but at least it's a starting point to take a look at the phenomenon through new eyes.
Yeah, well, that's what you have to do sometimes, just to shake it up and and see what new, because you never know where a valid insight's going to come from.
Well, that's right. That's what science is all about. That's right.
Very interesting. UFOs as a fractal phenomenon.
That's right. The larger question is there an intelligence behind the fractal, you see?
Yeah, what is that core?
That's right.
What is that seed?
And that is the key. I've never addressed that. I just don't have any idea where the energy comes from, how it's stored, how it's manipulated.
Who's doing the manipulating?
That's right.
Yeah. But interesting, fertile ground. Very interesting. Okay, we've talked about several of your books already. We've mentioned in passing the Melbourne episode. We've mentioned the Korean War, the advanced aerial devices, and you've got a number of I guess a lot of people aren't really aware that there was a lot of interesting things going on in the Korean War period, but there were, and we've already talked about one of those cases, but there were quite a few. And I guess they probably kind of swept under the rug or something. But
well, they were reported through channels. The problem was, I think, that we were in an infant stage of our understanding of the phenomenon. We didn't know what to do with them. It became kind of a headache for intelligence. The first interpretation was almost always an enemy weapon, you see. But then we finally began to realize that it wasn't a Russian or a North Korean weapon, it was something else. Well, then that just creates nothing but headaches, you see. You have to create a whole new classification or category, a bin, to put all these new files in, you see. And eventually it became Blue Book. Or Sign first, Project Sign first.
And Project Delta is an interesting book of yours because that deals with multiple UFO. And that adds a whole new layer it gives us a lot more to work with, I guess is what I'm getting at, than just a single thing. What is the significance for the viewers of the multiple UFO? I mean, how is that got more to it?
Well, okay, a little background on the book, how it came about. I was always impressed with single UFO cases. They're quite spectacular in most cases. You know, one object flying the sky and doing zigzags and so forth. And every once in a while I would come across, or be aware of, let's say, two objects flying side by side. But I never gave it much thought until, I don't know, 8 years ago or something. I said, hey, there may be some pay dirt in here that we can learn something from. And so I said, I'm going to go through the literature and see if I can find very many cases with multiple objects seen at the same time and place. Well, before I knew it, I had over 700 cases, which are in this book, Project Delta. By the way, delta is nothing, I use that in the scientific sense of change or dynamics, okay. So I must admit that writing that book, Project Delta, was part of my own maturing, because I was finally beginning to turn the corner from nuts and bolts ufology, you know, photographic analysis, which I know something about, done quite a bit. That kept me a long way back from the real issue of humanoids and intelligence and control and so forth. And so I said, well, I have to be honest about this and let the data speak for itself. What am I learning from these multiple witness cases, not only multiple witness, but multiple object cases, where the objects are executing precise, exquisite flight dynamics in the air? Well, I know something about flight dynamics. I fly and have a lot of friends who fly and work at a place that helped develop the concept, you know, during the war. And I began to realize that the Navy Blue Angels can't do what these things are doing. That in order to swap positions, for instance, in the sky, you have to not only know where you are at any moment in three-dimensional space, but you have to know where everyone else is at that same moment. Second, you have to be able to communicate back and forth. Third, you have to be able to execute energy management, it's called, thrust vectoring, in a very precise way to quickly go to swap positions. Well, these objects weren't just swapping positions. There are many, many cases in this book of armadas of objects, all the same shape. I think almost every case in that book, they're the same shape and they don't have wings. Well, all right, an armada of disks, let's call them, flying in rigid formation to each other, slowly across the sky, against the wind. They're not balloons. And then all of a sudden, they kind of buzz around each other like bees in a random formation, and now show up in two parallel lines. And a little further on, they buzz around a bit, reform into a chevron. Well, they're putting on a show. And if that isn't intelligence, I don't know what is. And lots of eyewitnesses on the ground. So that book just kind of blew me away. Ground witnesses, airplane witnesses, witnesses on trains, on boats, pilots, priests, policemen, every category you can think of. And then a whole bunch of statistics in the back, when, what, where, who, and so forth.
But strongly suggestive of intelligence.
That's right. And leading to CE5.
Right, exactly. And that's the two aspects of it right there that, again and again, the common theme that we keep returning to is the implication of intelligence.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
And one case in CE5 that really struck me was a case where a woman saw an object in the air, and this was one of the nonviolent, the positive outreaches or actions. And the woman, but she didn't use a flashlight or any overt objects. She simply thought, why don't you come a little closer so I can get a better look? And the object responded and did just that. And that seems to open a whole new door.
Yes, it does.
Sounds awfully like telepathy. It does. And so it's not just physical gestures and communication, but a real interesting form of nonverbal communication seems to be at work.
Well, we have to be cautious here, obviously, and if we only find a couple cases like that, it could be wishful thinking or coincidence or something. But I have a section in the introduction to this book, CE5, where I talk about coincidence. What is it? And I argue that coincidence is really the modern way of admitting we don't know the relationship between something. It's a convenient word to get us off the hook. We just don't know all the variables yet, so we call it a coincidence.
Like Jung's synchronicity.
I guess.
Kind of.
I guess so, yeah, right. That's right. But when you look at this chapter on human thought, I could look it up, there's quite a few cases. She isn't the only case, is my point, you see. And then you can argue, as a skeptic would, they're all coincidences. Well, you reach a point where it stretches credibility, when there are so many coincidences. And if science is going to be honest with itself, it eventually has to face up to this issue of coincidence.
Mm-hmm. If dragged kicking and screaming, nevertheless, you have to go, as you've said time and time again, where the data leads you.
Right.
Yeah. And wow, if that's evidence of telepathy, I guess we have a whole new psychology on the horizon, don't we? It raises questions not only about the objects and whatever intelligence might be behind them, but it raises questions about us and perhaps latent capabilities we don't even know we have.
That's right. Well, in that regard, the CSETI group tries to employ telepathy, as you know. They call it coherent thought sequencing, where the entire group assembled with some training tries to focus a common thought and then send it out. Well, that's telepathy, you see. And Dr. Greer's rationale for that is very interesting. I find it very interesting. That how else can we overcome the space-time distances that we have to overcome, that at the speed of light it isn't going to work. It just ain't going to work. But thought is instantaneous. And if you can think about being somewhere, you're there. In a certain dimension now. It breaks down, of course. But I think it's an interesting idea to think about. And then in the realm of psychic, or parapsychology is a better word, there's some reason to think there is efficacy or power in the thought process. The brain is a radiator. It's just a very incoherent radiator, and it's putting out microvolts rather than megavolts. You say, thank goodness. We'd be blowing all the fuses here. But as I again argue in this book, CE5, I think that you know what incoherence is, okay? That when you have a group of people assembled, they can't possibly be all thinking everything exactly at the same time so that they're in phase. Everyone's going to be out of phase and thus canceling each other. So it becomes a signal-to-noise ratio problem like SETI faces in listening. They're not projecting, they're only listening passively. So SETI comes along in a very interesting way and becomes proactive. And SETI, upon which they're kind of borrowing some ideas and so forth, are passive and only listening. I think that the SETI approach is far preferable. I really do.
Yeah, interesting. Proactive, certainly. Okay, you've got a couple of other books out there, Observing UFOs, which is kind of an investigator's manual, isn't it?
That's right. That was my first book.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's still a good one. I mean, it's a real handy, real solid, a manual, a handbook for what to do.
Well, yeah, that's partly what it was meant to be, but it had another objective, which I think has been overlooked, and it is to recognize that the human being, we are so wonderfully designed that we are walking dosimeters. We are walking biological sensing systems. And that if we know enough about hearing and seeing and smelling and touch and temperature and all that, and we know how the memory degrades and is fragmented and distorted and so forth, and also how it is reliable, that after the fact we can recreate something pretty accurately. That's really what's in that book, if you read it carefully. Few people have read the book carefully. So I argue that, you know what flash blindness is? Sure. Okay. Well, we know enough about flash blindness now from laboratory research to be able to tell you a lot about the original source of light that caused the flash blindness 5 days later. You see? Why? Because the little memory traces of the event are linked closely enough to what we remember seeing on the retina to be able to kind of extrapolate backward in time to the original event, which was the flash of light. In fact, that was my first major paper in ufology, basically. It was a paper at CUFOS, at one of their first annual conference, on the perception of extremely bright light. And it went into chapter and verse on this subject since I'd done my doctoral study on that. And I argued there that we ought to keep meticulous records about what we can see before, during, and after seeing a bright UFO. Because by doing that, hand the data to me and I can do some calculations and tell you quite a bit about the radiation characteristic of the UFO. Okay? In space and time.
Interesting approach. Yeah. And then you have UFO phenomena and the behavioral scientist.
Yes. Yeah, that was my second book, and that's a hard copy book that is a collection of chapters by various people, various professions, let's say. And Leo Sprinkle contributed a chapter. We had psychologists, psychiatrists, 2 anthropologists, a couple engineers, I said psychology, historian. I think that's it. And each one of us took kind of a different dimension of the phenomenon or characteristic and just went into it in some depth. And then I pulled it all together and gave it a little outline and so forth. And it's still a very popular book because it was academic. There were only PhDs. Now, I'm not saying that they know more than anybody else. That's not the point. But I think it was an attempt to show the academic community that this is an acceptable area to get involved with. So Armando Simon, for instance, who's a psychologist, he wrote a wonderful little chapter on the influence of the entertainment media on sightings, okay, science fiction movies, for instance. And Phyllis Fox is a sociologist. She went into some detail on sociological trends in our culture and UFO phenomenon. Dr. Roger Shepard, who is a psychologist at Stanford, did some of the pioneering work on very early computer modeling of three-dimensional shapes as viewed from different angles, which is very valuable. And Leo did the Carl Higdon case in he's the longest chapter in the book and the most detailed and so forth. And I did a couple chapters on how do people draw UFOs, okay? And since I remember that one a little better than the other ones, I was teaching classes in a university at the time, and so I had access to a lot of students. So I would ask them to help in a little experiment. I would hand out a piece of paper, usually about 30 students at a time, and ask them to, up in the corner, put your initials, your age, male or female, L or R for right or left, or AMB for ambidextrous, occupation if you had one, usually student, and finally, yes or no to the question, have you ever seen a UFO? And so they put yes or no. I said, turn your paper over. And then I said, would you please draw for me what you think a UFO looks like? Okay? And I said, for those of you who think you've seen one, draw what you remember seeing. Okay? And then I'd collect them all up and take them away and analyze them. Well, I've done that test with probably 3,000 people now. From Brazil, Germany, Austria, France, America, of course, and some other countries. So I have now published a lot of this. Well, when you take all those drawings and you put them into two stacks, yes, I've seen a UFO, and no, I have not seen a UFO, and then you analyze the drawings. There's a lot of ways you can analyze drawings. There aren't any differences. Fundamentally, there's no differences. Well, what's one possible explanation for that? Well, the explanation I like best is that everyone's seen a UFO. Some have seen it in the air, and some have seen it on television. You see, that we've all been contaminated. Right. So this is why I like children's drawings, because they don't see quite. Of course, it's too late now. They've all seen them now. Yeah. You get the idea. So drawing becomes, I think, just another dimension. If we're going to rely on drawings from witnesses, we should know the process that it goes from out there to the brain to the fingertips to the paper. That's what I was trying to look at.
Interesting. Yeah, media contamination. Yeah. Are you working on a new book now?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Well, I wouldn't call it a book. It's just a collection of pages right now that may or may not ever be published. And I don't want to say a whole lot about it, except that it's going to be a major job to do, and will involve aerodynamic analyses of shapes, and kind of a comparison of UFO shapes with what we know about airplane shapes. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, let's kind of in sum then. I know we want to be careful and not be premature about leaping to conclusions that are not warranted, but at the same time, as you're gathering the data and sifting through it, you do notice patterns, and things are suggestive. And with the proviso that it's tentative, what are your conclusions, or if conclusions are the right word? I mean, what's your kind of perspective? Maybe that's a better word. What do you think this is all about? What's at the core of this, the phenomenon? What's this UFO phenomenon represent?
Well, at a general conceptual level, it represents one of the greatest mysteries mankind's ever faced. I think that at a more practical level, it represents one of the most important phenomenon that we've ever had to cope with. And it holds promise for tremendous change of our society. I think it's going to teach us lessons in many, many areas. I'm not sure we're ready for them, and it might not teach us until we are, which brings us back to CE5 again, because if we are responsible in our CE5 kinds of behavior, we're not going to shoot guns anymore. We're going to be peaceful, you see. And maybe that's what they're waiting for us to develop some self-control, and then they'll say, hey, this species has kind of reached a point where we can now begin to interact with them. Kind of a maturity test or something. From another standpoint, I think the phenomenon represents a reflection of ourselves, like a Rorschach, like a projective technique or test, where we see whatever we want to see. And this is why we project ourselves so much into the phenomenon. Our anthropomorphic nature we've talked about. We see ourselves. And so if we're a fearful person, we will project that onto the UFO. Now, if that's true, then the phenomenon could just be natural. I can see a face in the cloud. That doesn't mean there's a face there. It means I see one. And I'm projecting a face. I'm using my imagination to see a face. On the other hand, where I am right now is that I'm really tending towards intelligence behind the phenomenon. It just seems to be coming out more and more as I look at it. But as a behavioral scientist, I have to be awfully careful. I'm not structuring the studies that I'm doing in such a way to come to the conclusions I want to come to, you see. So I need a lot of peer review, and I'm really open to that. I love to have people read my work and comment on it, and to show, hey, you really missed the boat on this point, or you really need to redo this approach because you're putting yourself into that. I don't want to do that. I have been quoted publicly as saying that I believe in life in outer space, and I don't have a problem with that. That's almost just a statistical given, given the creativity of God and the vastness of the universe and the fact that we exist. We prove that there's life, and somewhat intelligent. I'm not too sure how intelligent. So just by extrapolation or extension, there's very likely other sentient beings out there. Having said that, I think they're probably different than us, quite a bit different. And I don't think, like a doppelganger, there's a University of Wyoming on Alpha Centauri where 3 people are now in a room filming an interview, you see. I don't think so. I think it's probably going to be so fantastically different that we probably wouldn't even recognize it. So when people see, quote, aliens, alleged life forms that come into their homes or abduct them or allegedly abduct them, that's almost too simple. To me, the likelihood of that is not nearly as great as the likelihood of something that's totally invisible. I don't want to use the word spiritual or spirit, but something ethereal, kind of the spirit realm. To me, that's much more realistic. Or a plant spore.
In that case,
I may be breathing in aliens right now, you see, in the air.
Sure. If that's the case, then would maybe what the people do see and report, the beings, the humanoids, is that for our benefit, or is that not their true appearance? But
well, look at, if it's all mental projection from ourselves, this anthropomorphic bias that we're seeing, filtering only what we can accept, then it depends on whether we're self-destructive or not. You see, if it's good and positive, helpful, that's probably our nature to begin with. But if it's destructive and hateful and fearful, that may be just the way we are looking at life ourselves. Again, anthropomorphic bias. If they exist objectively and independently from us, there's 2 possibilities. Either they're going to react with us and to us in some interactive sense, or I think they're going to be just aloof. They might be here, but they don't care about us, and we care about them, but they don't care about us. So you find these wonderful stories about a UFO that lands in Central Park, and they hop out with shovels and buckets and start digging up dirt and throwing them in the buckets and getting on the ship and taking off. They don't care at Central Park with, 8 million people. They don't care if they're photographed. They don't care if they're shot at. It's all irrelevant, you see. Our visual system it occupies a very small segment of the electromagnetic spectrum. From about 400 to 800 nanometers, which is not much. And outside that is all the rest of the energy that exists, the frequencies that exist. And by shifting 10 nanometers outside the visible, you become invisible, right? But what if they're visual? Let's say they have a visual system. They might have a sonar system like a bat or a radar system. What if their sonar system, or their visual system, operates just in the X-ray? Then what they see here tonight are skeletons. Mm-hmm. They see a jaw moving, Yeah. You see the point. Sure. And they don't see our outside surface. We want them to see us, you see.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, yeah. Now, if in fact what the evidence suggestive that this is intelligence, and if that's the case, if there is some non-human intelligence behind all this anomalous aerial phenomenon and so forth, the implications of that are pretty astounding too. I mean, what it says about us and who we are, it raises all the questions of context, of, how we view the universe, how we view ourselves and our place in it and so forth, and those are pretty earth-shattering.
Can be. I prefer a world view that's big, or a universe view that's big enough to handle that.
Sure. But I suppose for many people it might be a disturbing...
of course. Sure. Some people are prisoners in their home,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about, just in passing, what do you think the impact or significance that the UFO phenomenon, especially if it is established eventually to have intelligence behind it, extraterrestrial or whatever it might be, what impact might that have not only on science but on religion, if any? Positive, negative?
Oh boy. Well, both are very similar. Science and religion are extremely similar to one another. So I guess I could give a common answer, and it would be that anytime you disrupt the status quo to an established dogma, which is what both those are basically, you got problems. You're threatening people's livelihoods and mindsets and belief structures and so forth. People don't like that, and so they're going to be hostile and upset, threatened, act negatively, do irrational things. And it's going to be, I think, a minority of citizens on this planet that will be able to handle it well. And I think generally Christians will do a good job, and by that I don't mean fundamentalists. I mean people who have a balanced view of what the Bible says about creation and the universe and the size of God and so forth, and who we are in creation. I think some philosophers will do well because they've already been thinking about it. They've rationally gone through the consequences of contact. Academics will not do well at all because they don't have a pigeonhole to put it in. It won't fit in the physics department, you see, or the psych department. It's going to be a new department. And universities don't like new departments, unless there's a lot of money that comes with it. Now, if the aliens come with a lot of gold, a lot of money somehow, or Krypton, or whatever it's going to be, I think academics will have a much less problem, you see. I'm being a little flip now.
Well, yeah, but, the new Department of UFO Studies will be open. And,
that's right.
Yeah, new jobs.
That's right.
Yeah, funding. Yeah, I think my own sense is that most of the major religious traditions would not have a problem with it, I think that where you do have the problem would be in the more fundamentalistic, with a very narrow worldview, that this would profoundly threaten.
I do. I agree with you. To me, the function of a government, a duly constituted government, a democracy, is to maintain the status quo so that life can go on normally, that people can follow, their desires and live happily ever after, and the pursuit of a pleasant life and so forth. Well, anything that disrupts that, be it a force from the outside or a social revolution from within, is generally dealt with pretty quickly by the powers that be. And they interpret it as a threat to themselves, individually as the leaders of the country. And then they use the country as their excuse for extermination or whatever they do to respond. By extermination, I'm referring to foreign countries now, in the past. And we hope not again anywhere else. UFO represent a whole new scale, maybe quality and quantity phenomenon that the leaders are going to have to face up with, you see, face up to. And they're going to have to discover how are they going to maintain the status quo when the status quo doesn't kind of go along with what they believe. So there's a mismatch between what the government's been telling us and what the people believe. And that credibility gap can be very damaging, extremely damaging.
So it would be in their interest to keep a lid on that, and that kind of brings us back to the deliberate ridicule we were kind of speculating about earlier.
Yeah. Not just ridicule. There have been so many people involved in UFO studies. It's just amazing when you look at the history. Every time you study a one-year period of the history of ufology, there's a whole new list of names, and one or two that follow across, When you look at a phenomenon that has that many participants who come and go, and how many hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitnesses a year in our country alone, and then you multiply that around the world, that there is a change going on, slow and deliberate, regular, I think, but it's a change for the benefit of the phenomenon. That little by little, as Leo has beautifully said in the past, Leo Sprinkle, he calls it cosmic consciousness conditioning, CCC. And I like that concept because it implies a teaching that little by little we're being conditioned to accept the much larger realm of space and the universe rather than this little ball we call Earth.
Bigger perspective.
That's right.
Yeah, which is appropriate under the circumstances and maybe necessary for us to grow.
Maybe.
Well, where can people obtain your books if they want to obtain any of the books that we've discussed?
Well, most of them are out of print. There is a book company in Florida called Arcturus Books, and Robert Gerard is the owner, and he sometimes has several copies of various titles of mine because he buys collections and things like that. The three books that I know that are still available from the publisher are Project Delta and the Korean book, Advanced Aerial Devices Reported During the Korean War. Those were both published out in California by LDA Press, and I know that there's still some left. Okay. This book, CE5, is available through all major bookstores as of June of 1999, Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble and so forth. And as far as I can tell, it's been shipped very quickly, and they do a good job in that regard. Okay. Oh, I have a phone number. Okay. I don't know how, is that appropriate? Absolutely. Okay. Well, they published a phone number for the publisher here that a person can call directly, and it's area 630-43-BRIGHT, B-R-I-G-H-T. Okay? That's 630-43-BRIGHT. And then apparently you just ask for a copy and give them the name and a Visa number and you got a book. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a website?
No. I don't want one either.
Okay. If people wanted to contact you to report a sighting or...
No, I'm not in that business, very frankly. I get too many emails as it is, and I can't take any more.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Is there anything, finally, in conclusion, is there anything that I haven't raised?
No.
That you feel is important, that should be said?
Oh, boy. Well, you asked me a question that we deferred, and I want you to ask that again, if you can remember it, because I thought it was insightful.
Well, I think it was kind of another way of phrasing the big question, the conclusion, the question of what do I think I phrased it in terms of the CE5 events, what they mean to ufology and what they mean to society.
Okay, well, let me take a cut at that. I like that question. What do CE5 events really signify to society? That's a very good question, because it forces us then to take those events seriously, first of all, and say that we are maturing, that there is a segment of society who is willing now to go out and act like fools and to maybe make contact, you see, but to make and make fools in a good sense, like a child would, makes himself a fool, in a childlike way, where there's no guile and there's no anger, there's no fear. A child is not afraid of something new for the first time, never seen it before. And that's exactly the way we must approach this phenomenon, I think. We must be little children. They don't, I can't say what they want, what they don't want, but if I were them, I wouldn't want to come to this planet and meet a bunch of blowhards, you know, a bunch of Einsteins who think they know everything. I would look for the humble person. And for all we know, that's what's happening here. That the CE5 mentality is one of not deprecation, but what's the word? Humility, perhaps. Of great humility that's willing to risk, willing to be friendly, willing to be ambassadors. And Steve Greer loves that concept. It's a good, solid concept, by the way. To be ambassadors for the rest of the people on the planet. The argument is very solid, that when the phenomenon occurs at random, you don't have any choice in the matter. You see? You don't pick the time and the place, usually. It just shows up when you're there. That means you and I are potential witnesses. At any time, it chooses us. CE5 comes along and reverses that role to some extent now and says we're going to be proactive. We're going to be more, positive about setting some of the parameters of the interchange. But we're also going to do it that if they are serious and come down and visit, that we're going to smile and we're going to embrace them in a friendly way and offer them the peace pipe, so to speak, you see, not shoot guns or weapons of some sort.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of food for thought here. Thank you very much for a really interesting interview.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I hope that you find something useful here and we can move forward from this.
Super. Thank you very much again. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Profiles in Ufology.